With 5 legions and a number of cavalry equal to that left on the continent, Caesar set sail around sunset, carried by a gentle southwest wind. A southwest wind blows a ship northeast, and that's the direction Caesar was headed from Gaul towards that mysterious island he departed from with unfinished business at the end of the last book we covered, Britannia. The year is 54 BC, and Caesar still hasn't been to Rome since he left 4 years earlier. Presiding over Rome as consuls for the year are one of Caesar's most determined, sworn enemies, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, and another guy, a sort of a wild card, the corrupt aristocrat Appius Claudius, who is the brother of the infamous Clodius. So home front threats are never far from Caesar's mind when he's on campaign, and especially this year, he's under constant pressure to keep sending back news of success and victories. Hence his resolve now to give the Britons a taste of the might of Rome. I'm Alex Petkus, and this is The Cost of Glory, where it is our mission to see what we can learn and apply from the deeds and lives of the greatest Greeks and Romans. In this episode, part 5 of 8 of our series, we look at highlights from book 5 of 8 of Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, De Bello Gallico. Now, before leaving his winter duties as peacetime governor of northern Italy, that's Cisalpine Gaul, Caesar gave his troops instructions to build a massive fleet in the year previous to the year that we're covering now. So they're building a fleet over the winter of mostly transport ships. And we'll get to what he does with those transport ships in a moment and how that went. But it's worth dwelling for just a moment on what he was doing in the winter leading up to this expedition. See, this is probably when he composed his treatise De Analogia, on analogy, and sent it back to Rome. That text is now lost, and it only exists in a few quotes and fragments now, so we know something about it, and it's mentioned by other authors. But we know that it was a lengthy treatment of proper Latin style and grammar, which is an amazing thing to come from the man leading the conquest of Gaul, don't you think? I've written about this work at greater length in my newsletter, by the way, which you should subscribe to at costofglory.com. Well, Caesar wrote De Analogia as a response to a comment. This is what scholars think, at least, and I think it's right. Cicero made some comment in his masterwork on the art of eloquence called De Oratore. And so essentially, Caesar is responding to Cicero, making some big treatise about the art of oratory, which many young men were very interested in. And essentially, while he is in the off-season of his campaign, Caesar's keeping up his appearances in absentia as a serious literary authority in Rome, which I think is amazing. And this is also probably the winter that Caesar read Lucretius's great Epicurean philosophical poem on the nature of things, De Rerum Natura, because we start to see verbal echoes of it in the Gallic War commentaries around this time. I mean, the scope and the variety of the things that this man is able to juggle is really astounding. But now he's back in action again, and here's what he finds when he returns to Gaul. Quote, "When he returned to Gaul, he went around all the winter quarters and learnt that by the exemplary energy of the soldiers, and in spite of the utmost lack of all necessaries, about 600 ships of the type set forth above," he means transport ships, "and 28 war ships had been built, and lacked but little to make them ready for launching in a few days. Caesar warmly commended the troops and the officers who had been in charge of the work, and he gave his instructions, and he commanded all the ships to assemble at the Itian port." End quote. And the Itian port is more or less modern Boulogne in northern France. It's a great place to cross the channel to Britain from. But I mean, this idea that over the winter his troops built 600 transport ships and 28 warships, which is a lot. I think it doesn't need a lot of explaining to make that point. I mean, this is a great reminder that if you just look at what its yearly man-hours are dedicated to, a Roman army could fairly be described as a heavily armed construction company. Maybe there's an idea for how to solve the problem of, say, a rail infrastructure project that takes 10 years and $1 billion to lay 5 miles of track. I don't know. Well, anyway, so Caesar is about to set sail for Britain, right? When he gets an embassy from the treachery, which is a powerful Belgian tribe that lives near the Rhine. They're on the Gaul side of the Rhine, but they're in the wilder parts of Gaul. And Caesar says they have by far the greatest number of cavalry in all of Gaul, so they're powerful. And Caesar's going to do some great foreshadowing here before he gets to the British expedition. Essentially, among the treachery, there are two leaders. Cingetorix is one of them, and Indutiomarus is the other. And these guys are vying for the supremacy of the treachery. And by the way, the treachery gave their name to the city of Trier in Germany. That's Germany's oldest city, founded under Augustus. So Cingetorix, one of them, comes to Caesar personally, and he says, hey, he wants to be friends of the Roman people. And Caesar's very pleased with this. But the rival, Indutiomarus, does not come to Caesar. Here's Caesar, quote, Indutiomarus, on the other hand, began to raise horse and foot and to prepare for war as soon as he had hidden away those whose age made them unfit for service in the forest of the Ardennes, which is of great size, stretching right through the territory of the treachery from the River Rhine to the border of the Remi. So it's looking dangerous, but some of the chiefs of the treachery, he says, compelled by their friendship with Cingetorix, and at the same time alarmed at the coming of our army, came to Caesar, and, they tell him what's going on with Indutiomarus and how they're not happy about it. They don't want to have anything to do with it. What's going on with Caesar here? Quote, then Indutiomarus feared that he might get deserted by one and all, and he sent deputies to Caesar. So remember, Cingetorix came to Caesar, but then Indutiomarus didn't. Well, Indutiomarus urged that his reluctance to leave his own folk and to come to Caesar was merely based on his own desire to keep the state more easily to its allegiance to Rome, he means, lest if the whole of the nobility left them, the common people might go astray through ignorance. Always those common people stirring up trouble among the Gauls, as they describe it at least. Finishing up here with Caesar. As a result, Indutiomarus said the state was in his power, and if Caesar allowed, Indutiomarus would come to his headquarters and commit the fortunes of himself and of the state to his protection. End quote. And Caesar says that he sees through this, that it's an excuse, but he doesn't want to delay his expedition to Britain. So here's what he does. Quote, Caesar commanded Indutiomarus to come to him with 200 hostages. When these were brought in, among them his son and all his relatives, whom Caesar summoned by name, he comforted Indutiomarus and exhorted him to abide in loyalty. Now, having been through 4 years of the Gallic Wars, we know just about how reliable a guarantee of loyalty keeping hostages is, right? It's not reliable at all. Again, this is foreshadowing going on here. Nevertheless, Caesar assembled at his headquarters the chiefs of the treachery and won them over, each individually, for Cingetorix. So in other words, he's telling all the Treveran nobles, hey, Cingetorix is the guy you should listen to. He's the one who has my favor. And that's a pretty big deal for a tribal leader. Going on, Caesar was aware that Cingetorix deserved this of him, but he deemed it also of great importance that the authority of one whose signal goodwill towards himself he had fully proved should be as strong as possible among his own folk. And then here's the ominous note. This action Indutiomarus took grievously to heart. Now, I guess Indutiomarus is still there at Caesar's camp when this happens. For he saw, Indutiomarus that is, that his own influence among his people was being diminished. And though he had previously felt hostility towards us, his indignation now burst far more vehemently into flame. End quote. So the pot is starting to heat up among the Belgae, and it's going to boil over in a big way later in the book. But Caesar wants to get moving to Britain. Now, for his expedition, Caesar decides to take with him as many of the Gallic nobility as he can, as auxiliary cavalry. So he requisitions them from all over the country. And he does this both because they're good cavalry, but even more so, he explicitly says this, because he wants to prevent them from stirring up trouble while he's gone. So he's got, taking the leadership of Gaul with him. And one of these guys that he, requisitions to come and join him on his expedition is a man we met in Book 1, Dumnorix of the Aedui, who you may recall was responsible for stirring up rebellion among his people, the Aedui, who were normally quite loyal to the Romans. So Dumnorix, he starts to make excuses to Caesar about how he doesn't want to go on the expedition to Britain. He wants to be allowed to stay in Gaul. Now he's saying, he can't abide boats. He gets seasick. Now he's saying that he's hindered by some religious obligations. And Caesar suspects that he's planning some mischief. Quote, "When Dumnorix had met with a firm refusal and all hope remaining was taken away, he began to stir up the Gallic chieftains, drawing them aside individually and exhorting them to stay on the continent. Then he sought to frighten them by sowing suspicion that there was some reason for stripping Gaul of all her nobility, that it was Caesar's design to transport to Britain and there slaughter all whom he feared to put to death in the sight of Gaul. To the rest he pledged his word and demanded of them an oath that they would execute by common consent whatever they judged to be best for the advantage of Gaul. These plots were reported to Caesar by several persons." End quote. So it's like Dumnorix thinks that Caesar isn't going to find out. Amazing. Well, after some weather delays, Caesar's finally ready to go, and he orders his army to start preparing to embark, getting in the ships. He's still expecting Dumnorix is eventually going to do the smart thing and give in and come along. But, quote, "But while all were preoccupied with this, Dumnorix took some Aeduan horsemen, and without Caesar's knowledge, he left the camp for home. Upon report of this, Caesar stopped the departure of the ships. Then he dispatched a large detachment of cavalry to follow up Dumnorix, with orders to call him back, and if he offered force or refused to obey, to put him to death. For he supposed that a man who had disregarded the command in Caesar's actual presence would do nothing right-minded behind his back. And indeed, when Dumnorix was summoned to return, he sought to resist and to defend himself by force. I imagine he drew his sword or something, entreating the help of his followers and crying repeatedly that he was a free man and of a free state. The pursuers, as they were ordered, surrounded the man and dispatched him. But the horsemen of the Aedui all returned to Caesar." End quote. So much, then, for Dumnorix of the Aedui. So, to make a long story short, Caesar arrives more or less where he arrived the first time, in the far southeast, around Deal and Walmer, and also perhaps more notably near Sandwich. And when he arrives, it's as though the agreements and treaties that he made with the British leaders the year before never even happened. The natives, he finds out, they came out in force to oppose him, but then when they saw this massive armada that he brought, they retired to the forest nearby. Meanwhile, he's learned that the Britons have put a pause to all their incessant warring amongst themselves as soon as they heard the Romans were coming, and they've chosen as their leader of the war effort a man named Cassivellaunus. So the fighting is about to break, it's coming, and we're going to get to Cassivellaunus in a moment. But first I want to share with you a few paragraphs of the famous first ethnography of Britain that Caesar offers us here. And scholars doubt whether Caesar wrote all of this himself. Maybe it was some people on his staff who did the research, who knows. But I think, following the Roman principle of Caesar built the bridge, that he probably deserves much of the credit here. And some of the details of what he says that we're going to go through are kind of doubtful and debated. I'll comment here and there, but rather than get bogged down and fact-checking everything, let's just mainly listen to what Caesar has to say. Quote, "The inland part of Britain is inhabited by tribes declared in their own tradition to be indigenous to the island, whereas the maritime part is held by tribes that migrated at an earlier time from Belgium to seek booty by invasion. Nearly all of these latter are called after the names of the states from which they sprang when they went to Britain. And after the invasion, they dwelt there and began to till the fields." Going on, "The population is immense. The farm buildings are found very close together, being very like those of the Gauls. And there is a huge store of livestock animals. They use either bronze or gold coins, or instead of coined money, small ingots of iron of a certain standard of weight." So archaeologists have actually recovered many of these. Some of them are shaped like little swords. Some are shaped like little plows. Let's go on. "In the Midland districts of Britain, tin is produced. In the maritime, iron. But of that there is only a small supply. The bronze they use is imported." Caesar's probably actually mistaken there on the tin. That's one of Britain's major resources, famously in antiquity. It's essential for forging bronze. They probably got the tin from Cornwall and not the Midlands, for what it's worth. Going on here, "There is timber of every kind, as in Gaul, save beech and pine. They consider it wrong to eat of hare, fowl, and goose, but these they keep for pastime or pleasure. The climate is more temperate than in Gaul, the cold seasons more moderate." And I'm going to skip a bit here, but it's about to get pretty interesting. "Of all the Britons, the inhabitants of Kent, an entirely maritime district, are by far the most civilized, differing but little from the Gallic manner of life." And the Latin there for Kent is Cantium. That's the far southeast, which is where Caesar landed. "Of the inlanders, most do not sow grain, but live on milk and flesh and clothe themselves in skins." Archaeology actually contradicts Caesar here. The Britons did not just live on milk and flesh. They actually did widely cultivate wheat. "All the Britons, indeed," listen to this, "dye themselves with woad." That's a kind of plant, "which produces a blue color and makes their appearance in battle more terrible." And blue-dyed Britons are actually 100% backed up by archaeology, it turns out. "They wear long hair and shave every part of the body save the head and the upper lip." So they have big mustaches. And here's where it gets a little weird. "Groups of 10 or 12 men have wives together in common, and particularly brothers along with brothers, and fathers along with sons. But the children born of the unions are reckoned to belong to the particular house to which the maiden was first conducted." End quote. And that last bit, I'm not sure that we have any great way to verify. But there you have Britain and the Britons, a strange place that Caesar's found himself. All right, now for the campaign. Once he gets there, Caesar meets the British forces. They've got their army in the neighborhood of where he landed. They have a few minor to moderate engagements right near his camp. And here he explains some of the Romans' difficulty in dealing with the natives. So they're using these light-armed, hit-and-run style tactics. And he says, quote, "The action took place in front of the camp and under the eyes of all, and it was clear that in all such fighting our own infantry, because of their heavy armament, were but poorly fitted for an enemy of this kind, since they could neither pursue a retreating enemy nor venture far from the standards. It was clear again that our cavalry fought with great risk, because the enemy often retreated intentionally, and when they had separated our horsemen a little from the legions, leapt down from their chariots," remember they're riding these chariots, "and fought on foot to our disadvantage." End quote. So in a head-on engagement, the ancients generally regarded infantry as having advantage over cavalry. Cavalry can chase you as you're running and has more endurance, but in a head-on engagement, it's the infantry. So the chariots that the Britons are using have the best of both worlds. So there's some challenges there, and the Romans defeat the Britons in a couple of little skirmishes. They have some successes here. They're starting to learn how to deal with them. But then the Britons eventually just stop engaging the Romans directly. They start using full-on guerrilla tactics, ambushes, refusing to give battle, etc. So Caesar decides he can't pin these guys down. It's time to march on the homeland of this king, if you will, this Cassivellaunus, who's leading all of the Britons. But to do this, Caesar has to become the first Roman to cross the Tamasis River, the Thames. Quote, Caesar led his army into the borders of Cassivellaunus and up to the river Thames, which can be crossed at one place only on foot, and that with great difficulty. When he was arrived there, he noticed that on the other bank of the river a great force of the enemy was drawn up. The bank was fortified with a fringe of sharp projecting stakes, and stakes of the same kind fixed under water were concealed by the stream. And listen to what he does here. It's very impressive. I guess he didn't want to build a bridge, by the way, because the river is probably very wide and it would have taken a couple of weeks, and he considered speed to be of the essence, is what I'm imagining. So he's going to cross the river here. When he had learnt these details, spikes into the water, from prisoners and deserters, Caesar sent the cavalry in advance, across the river that is, and he ordered the legions to follow up instantly. And the troops moved with such speed and such spirit, although they had only their heads above the water. So they have to be carrying very heavy gear to keep their feet on the riverbed, don't you think? And the enemy could not withstand the assault of the legions and the cavalry, but abandoned the banks and betook themselves to flight. End quote. So, once again, incredible Roman determination at its best here. I mean, water up to your neck that you're crossing on foot. He's got 5 legions, and that's a pretty large army. It's a very large army for Britannia, and they just overwhelm the defenders on the other side of the bank. So they've taken the other side of the river. Once Caesar is across, though, Cassivellaunus keeps to his guerrilla tactics, and it's impossible to pin him down and defeat him. But Caesar has an even better card to play. There's a rival prince who comes to him from a powerful tribe called the Trinobantes. There's a kid named Mandubracius, and it turns out on his rise to power, Cassivellaunus, this leader of the Britons, he killed this kid's father, Mandubracius' dad. And so now young Mandubracius, a prince, he brings some Trinobantian nobles with him, and he offers the allegiance of his tribe to Rome if Caesar can protect him and restore him to his throne. So, of course, Caesar gladly accepts this offer. Hey, it's an opportunity to use some classic Roman diplomacy, right? Playing off one local constituency off another. And so the Trinobantes, this great tribe, they declare for Rome. And this strips Cassivellaunus of some of his support. But the war still isn't over. Cassivellaunus, meanwhile, he rallies the tribes that are still loyal to him, and he holes up in his hometown, apparently, which Caesar describes kind of like what passes for a fort in Britain. And scholars think that it's most likely a certain Iron Age hill fort that archaeologists have excavated, now known as Verlamion or Verulamium, which is modern St. Albans. It's a town about an hour northwest of modern London. And here's how Caesar describes it and what happens. Quote, now the Britons call it a stronghold when they have fortified a thick-set woodland with rampart and trench. The Latin there is oppidum, and Caesar's clearly writing with some disdain here. It's nothing like the fortified strongholds that he's had to capture in Gaul going on here. And it is their custom to gather there to avoid enemy attacks. Caesar now set out for this spot with the legions. He found it thoroughly fortified by nature and by handiwork. But nonetheless, he made a vigorous assault from 2 sides. The enemy held up for a brief time, but did not withstand the assault of our troops, and broke out and fled from another side of the stronghold. A great quantity of cattle was found there, and many of the enemy were caught in the act of fleeing and put to death. End quote. So Cassivellaunus, he's got his hometown taken from him. But he still doesn't give up. Brave man. He sends to friends of his who are back in Kent, back near where Caesar's base is, where he landed, to try to attack him from the rear, destroy his supply lines. And his allies, they attack the Roman camp by the boats on the shore in Sandwich, but the Romans fight them off and defend them. And at last, Cassivellaunus decides the jig is up. He approaches Caesar through a Gallic intermediary and comes to terms. And then, quote, Caesar had determined to winter on the continent in view of sudden commotions in Gaul, and as he had little of the summer left and was aware that it might easily be spun out to no purpose there in Britain, he made a requisition of hostages and determined what tribute Britain should pay yearly to Rome. He sternly charged Cassivellaunus to do no hurt to Mandubracius, the kid, or the Trinobantes, end quote. And with that, he loads up his ships, and he has to make 2 trips, and he returns to Gaul. And that's that. Now, Napoleon echoes the judgment of many historians when he observes the following, quote, Caesar's second expedition to Britain had no better outcome than the first, since he did not leave behind any garrison or establishment, and the Romans were no more masters of the place afterwards than before, end quote. After all, he's leaving no troops there. It's certainly not a province. Maybe there was some nominal tribute he imposed that he mentions here, but it was going to be very difficult for the Romans to enforce that without going on another full-on campaign. And that full-on campaign, eventual takeover of Britain, that's not going to happen until the campaign in 43 AD under the Emperor Claudius, nearly a century later, the official beginning of direct Roman rule of Britannia. But actually, many scholars have noted that Caesar's incursion had noticeable impact on the culture of Britain. There's evidence that trade routes were opened up more. Seems that the local nobles were clearly impressed, and they were impressed also with what was happening across the Channel in Gaul. And they start to adopt, you can see this apparently in the archaeological record, some Roman habits and Roman dress. And, they're starting to party like the Romans a little bit. Some of the Britons, this is the upshot here, some of them are at least seeing the Romans as potential, cultural models, or perhaps more specifically, arbiters in their conflicts amongst themselves, like Caesar was between Mandubracius and Cassivellaunus. And so I think it's fair to say that this really was the beginning of the long history of Roman and eventually Christian Roman Britain, culminating in the legends of King Arthur, a shadowy 5th century AD monarch in a lawless late antique world, a world where King Leodogran, father of Guinevere, groaned for the Roman legions here again, and Caesar's eagle, as Tennyson wrote. At the very least, Caesar surely ended his campaign on a high note with a good story to send back to the crowds in the Roman Forum to adulate at the success of their newest and perhaps greatest glorious commander. But his arrival back to the continent is more bitter than sweet. Caesar in his text, De Bello Gallico, with characteristic professionalism, he completely omits maybe the most important political development of the entire year. Probably the most devastating personal loss of the whole war. So instead, I'll quote Plutarch here from his Life of Caesar. Quote, in Gaul, Caesar found letters which were about to be sent across to him, that is to Britain. They were from his friends in Rome and advised him of his daughter's death. She died in childbirth at Pompey's house. You may recall, if you're familiar with Caesar's bigger story, that Pompey was both his greatest rival and married to Caesar's only child, his daughter Julia. Great was the grief of Pompey, and great the grief of Caesar, and their friends were greatly troubled too. They felt that the relationship which alone kept the distempered state in harmony and concord was now dissolved, for the babe also died presently, after surviving its mother a few days. Now Julia, against the protests of the tribunes, was carried by the people to the Campus Martius, where her funeral rites were held and where she lies buried." End quote. Perhaps this news is why, even though it was just late September, with still plenty of time for a little campaigning, Caesar decided to call it in early for the year 54 and station his troops in winter quarters. Maybe he wanted to give himself some time to grieve. But if that's right, Caesar was about to discover that this year's campaigns were far from over. Now, Caesar's got his legions all spread out in northern Gaul, mostly in the territory of various Belgic tribes. And shortly after they all get there, an incident occurs that spins out into a full-fledged crisis. And it's worth focusing on because it's an amazing drama illustrating how clever, competent men can get deceived into making disastrous decisions. And I think that's why Caesar puts so much attention on this episode. So all while Caesar's been in Britain, this resentful rival leader of the Treachery that we mentioned earlier, Indutio Maris, the Treachery, again, are that Belgic tribe that lives near the Rhine. Indutio Maris has indeed been quietly stirring up rebellion. And the leaders of another tribe, called the Eburones, have been listening. And amazingly, they've been cooperating with the Romans and bringing them grain and stuff. And suddenly, these guys surprise some Roman troops as they're gathering supplies, and they attack them and chase them into their fort. The Eburones are even further north than the Treachery, so it's pretty remote territory. But then things get interesting. The leaders of the Eburones approach the walls of the fort, and they invite the Romans out for a parley. So the Roman commanders say, all right, and they send a couple of men out. And the ambassadors find themselves talking to this very crafty Belgian Gaul named Ambiorix, leader of the Eburones. And listen carefully to what Ambiorix says. Quote, "Before them Ambiorix spake as follows. He admitted that he was very greatly indebted indeed to Caesar for his good offices towards himself. For it was by Caesar's doing that he had been set free from the tribute which he had been accustomed to pay his neighbors the Aduatuci, and by Caesar's action that a son and nephew, sent to the Aduatuci as hostages and kept in their country in slavery and bondage, had been sent back to him. He declared that his action in assaulting the camp had been the result not of judgment or intention on his part, but of compulsion on the part of his state, and that the conditions of his own sovereignty were such that the people had as much authority over him as he himself over the people." End quote. So he's saying, I didn't want to authorize this attack, but my constituency forced my hand. And that's a typical Gallic excuse for treachery in Caesar's commentaries. So this is kind of a red flag to the reader going on here. His state, moreover, had gone to war because it had not been able to resist the sudden conspiracy of the Gauls. He could easily prove that by the insignificance of his own position, for he was not so ignorant of affairs as to believe that by his own forces the Roman people could be overcome. He's saying, we Eburones, we're a puny nation. My people wouldn't have dared to attack you if there weren't something bigger afoot throughout Gaul. No, there was common consent among the Gauls. This was the day appointed for assaulting all the camps of Caesar, in order that one legion might not be able to come to the support of another. It would not have been easy for Gauls to refuse Gauls, especially when they considered that the design they had entered on was for the recovery of their common freedom. And now, having satisfied the Gauls as far as the claim of his country required, he had regard to his duty in response to the good offices of Caesar. And he pleaded with Sabinus, that's the commander, who's going to get the message, for the sake of their friendship, to take measures for his own and for his soldiers' safety. In other words, he means, I decided to allow my people to attack because right now, as we speak, all of Gaul is rising up. And I'd look like a traitor to my race if I hadn't done this. But really, I want to help you guys out and return Caesar's favor to me. And to explain what he means, Ambiorix offers the following story. He says, quote, "A great company of Germans had been hired and had crossed the Rhine. In 2 days it would be at hand. It was for the Romans themselves to consider whether they would choose to bring the troops out of their forts before neighbors could know of it, and to march them either to Cicero," that's Quintus Cicero, one of Caesar's legates. This is the younger brother of the great orator Marcus Cicero. More on Quintus Cicero shortly. "Or to Labienus, one of whom was about 50 miles from them, the other a little further." So those are the two other nearest Roman commanders, 50 plus miles away. He's saying, go to them quickly. Ambiorix promised them and confirmed it with an oath that he would grant them safe passage through his own borders. In so doing, he said he was consulting the interests of his state by relieving it of the burden of legionary forts. The locals are basically constrained to supply the Roman forts. And so he's saying, oh, this is in my interests too, so it's not a trick. I'm just trying to look out for my people. And he was making a return also to Caesar according to his merits. After delivering this address, Ambiorix departed. End quote. And so the ambassadors return and they bring this message to the commanders at the fort. Well, if you're the commander of the fort, what do you think of that? You're off at the edge of civilization with a legion and a half, is what Caesar says, maybe 7,000 men. The closest legion is at least 3 days' journey away, more than 50 miles. And you're told all hell is breaking loose all across Gaul right now. Do you take this man's word for it? Who's the leader of a nation that's just attacked you? But, remember, he has a plausible story that he has reasons to be on good terms with Rome. And you're already spooked too by this sudden unexpected attack, and he's suggesting you go join up with another legion, presumably to unite and fight off this huge war that's just breaking out. Oh, and the Germans are coming as we speak. Well, what do? Make a break for it? Get ready for a terrible siege? What if it's all a trick? Well, the commanders of the fort have a meeting. One of them, who seems to be the senior commander, is Quintus Titurius Sabinus, who Ambiorix mentioned in his speech. And we covered Sabinus in Book 3, executing some fine generalship, luring some Gauls in Normandy into fighting on very compromising terrain. He's no dunce. And the other commander, who seems to be junior to Sabinus here, maybe he's commanding that half legion, it's a guy named Cotta. And here's Caesar, quote, "The commanders were alarmed by the sudden news, and though the statement was made by an enemy, they nevertheless considered that it must not be disregarded. One thing especially stirred their anxiety. It was indeed scarcely credible that the Eburones, an undistinguished and insignificant state, had dared of their own motion to make war on Rome. They accordingly submitted the question to a council of war, and a great dispute arose among them. Cotta, with several tribunes and centurions of the first rank, thought that nothing should be done rashly, and no departure from winter quarters made without Caesar's orders. They sought to show that even German forces, no matter how numerous, could be withstood by entrenched fortifications. There was proof of it in the fact that they had most gallantly withstood the first charge of the enemy, and had actually dealt them many wounds. They're referring to this very recent attack on the troops. They were not hard-pressed for grain. Meanwhile, reinforcements would reach them alike from the nearest forts and from Caesar. In sum, what was more senseless or more discreditable than to take the advice of an enemy in deciding supreme issues?" End quote. Pretty sound reasoning there. And they make a good point that the Roman forts are incredibly strong positions to fight from against your average ill-equipped Gallic assault. And while independent legates, commanders that is, have a lot of leeway, moving your army 50 plus miles without orders would be extremely frowned on, except in the direst circumstances. But then, you gotta think maybe the circumstances really are dire. Well, here's what Sabinus thinks. Against this, Sabinus kept shouting that it would be too late to act when larger bodies of the enemy, with Germans in addition, had come up, or when some disaster had been experienced in the legionary forts next to their own. There was short time, he said, for deliberation. And this is really interesting, what he says here. Sabinus believed that Caesar had started for Italy already. Otherwise, the Carnutes would not have conceived the design of murdering Tasgetius. It's another episode Caesar mentions earlier that we didn't talk about. A tribe just murdered some pro-Roman leader that Caesar had installed. Nor with Caesar present would the Eburones now have come against the camp with so profound a contempt for us. End quote. So he's saying there's good reason to believe they know something we don't know. It's like, hey, I bet Caesar's actually already gone back to Cisalpine Gaul to hold the assizes and to do his provincial governor duties. And you get the sense that Sabinus here is also thinking maybe he can make Caesar proud in his absence, take some initiative, be the hero, fend off the war. Caesar, in fact, was not on his way back to Italy at all, as we'll see later. But we're going to go on with Sabinus's arguments here. He had regard not to the suggestion of the enemy, but to the fact. The Rhine was close at hand. The Germans were highly indignant at the death of Ariovistus and our previous victories, which we talked about in Book 1. Gaul was incensed at all the insults experienced since it was brought in subjection to the authority of Rome, and at the extinction of its earlier renown in war. And he's not wrong there. Sabinus is basically saying, guys, this could be the big one that we've all been expecting to happen. So this goes on a while. Sabinus and Cotta, they start shouting at each other, and it goes on till midnight, until Cotta is just exasperated and exhausted. He gives up, and Sabinus wins the day. They're going to make a break for it. And if you're familiar now with Caesar's best practices for generalship, you're going to start to get a twisting feeling in your stomach hearing what they do next. Quote, "It was announced that the troops would march at dawn. The rest of the night was spent without sleep, for each soldier was looking over his effects to see what he could carry with him and what part of the winter equipment he needed to leave. They thought of any and every plea to prove that it must be dangerous to remain, and that the danger would be increased by the exhaustion of the troops in long watches, i.e., if they stayed. At dawn, they marched forth from camp, in the fashion of men persuaded that counsel had been given them not by an enemy, but by Ambiorix, a devoted friend. The column was very lengthy and the baggage very heavy. The enemy heard the racket the soldiers were causing and perceived they were staying up all night." End quote. So the Romans are exhausted. They're moving in obvious haste, completely with their guard down in a very vulnerable formation. And before they even left the gates, the Eburones knew exactly what the Romans were doing. What do you think happens? Indeed, it was a trick. Ambiorix and his men wait till the soldiers are 2 miles from their camp, and they ambush them in a thick forested valley. Quote, "Then Sabinus, since he had not anticipated any of this, finally acted, but only by anxiously running hither and thither, posting cohorts. Yet even this he did in a timid fashion and in a way that made it clear that he had no mental resources left, as generally happens when men are forced to devise a plan when action is already happening." I think this is a really interesting comment there that Caesar makes. Caesar is implicitly contrasting Sabinus with people like, Caesar. Whenever Caesar's going into any situation, he always anticipates various possibilities, especially the worst ones, and he has rough sketches of a plan of what he'll do if this or that happens. I mean, this is really damning of Sabinus, that even after this furious debate with Cotta, which prominently featured the question, what if this is a trap, he hasn't even taken the basic precautions to cap his downside. He could have marched in tighter order with rested troops. He could have, packed in secret, been more on guard, etc., etc. And in the battle here, Caesar contrasts Cotta. Cotta, however, as he had thought this might happen on the march and for that reason had opposed departure, neglected nothing for the safety of the force. In addressing and encouraging the troops, he did his duty as a commander. In action, his duty as a soldier. I'll skip the details here, but Cotta snaps into action with a clear mind. He moves the soldiers into some more favorable formations, importantly, because he was expecting something bad. But all this is to no avail. They get surrounded, wrapped into a tight knot. The Gauls are lightly armed. They're throwing missiles at them. They're confident. They're retreating whenever the heavy-armed, slower Romans try to make a sally out. Men are dying left and right. It's terrible. Caesar names many Romans who fought bravely, though, in the struggle. But what ends up happening is Sabinus, he flies the white flag, so to speak, tries to have a parley with Ambiorix. And Ambiorix lets him approach. And then, quote, meanwhile, while they were discussing terms and Ambiorix was intentionally launching a quite lengthy speech, Sabinus was gradually surrounded and killed. End quote. And the enemy resumes the fighting immediately. Almost the entire army is killed, including Cotta, who fought on bravely to the end. Most are killed on the battlefield. A few escape to the fort, but far fewer escape than have any hope of defending the fort, and they decide to commit suicide rather than get captured by the Gauls. A very few men escape with their lives into the forest and live to tell the story later. It's a complete disaster. 7,000 men lost, scores of officers killed, possibly the worst disaster of the entire Gallic campaign. All because Ambiorix was able to deceive Sabinus with a mixture of fear and desire, probably the two most powerful emotions to blind our wits. Here, the fear of destruction and the desire to win distinction by taking some bold unilateral action. But now, Ambiorix has gotten very excited indeed, and he goes and he riles up the Nervii with the message that this is our chance for the Belgae to throw off the yoke of the Romans once and for all. Now, the Nervii were a particularly tough and wild tribe that Caesar defeated with great difficulty back in Book 2, Part 2 of the series, after they ambushed him. And you might recall the way that he describes the event. It seemed like the Nervii were practically obliterated from the face of the earth. Well, from what follows, you think maybe he was exaggerating a little bit. But after that humiliating event, you can imagine the Nervii are very receptive to Ambiorix's revolt message, and camped in the territory of the hitherto pacified Nervii is Quintus Cicero, again the brother of the great orator Marcus Cicero. Caesar brought Quintus on as a legate, partly maybe as a favor to Marcus, after getting Marcus to grudgingly agree to a political reconciliation that we've discussed in earlier episodes. But now, Quintus is going to get a chance to really prove himself, because things are about to get very ugly. And this whole episode is some of Caesar's finest storytelling in all the commentaries, so let's take a look. So once again, the Gauls decide to open by ambushing some unsuspecting Romans from Quintus Cicero's legionary fort, who were out in the country foraging for firewood and such. The Romans manage to defend themselves with only a few casualties. They flee into their camp, and everyone mans the ramparts and digs in. Cicero's in charge of one legion, 4,500 maybe, 5,000 men, and he's getting attacked by an alliance of Eburones, Nervii, and Aduatuci that, according to Caesar, add up to about 60,000 men. And here's what he does. And note the speed with which Caesar narrates these developments in short sentence bursts. Quote, "Dispatches were sent at once by Cicero to Caesar, with the promise of great rewards if the bearers carried them safe. All the roads were blocked, and the messengers were cut off. During the night he built about 120 towers with incredible speed out of the timber which had been collected for making an entrenchment. All apparent deficiencies in the earthworks were rectified. On the next day, the enemy assaulted the camp with a far larger force, which they had assembled, and filled in the trench. They're trying to breach the walls by filling in the defensive trench in front of them. Our troops resisted in the same fashion as on the day before. Exactly the same was done on the other days following. There was no pause in the work, even at any time in the night. No chance of rest was given to sick or wounded. All that was needed for the next day's assault was made ready in the night. Quantities of stakes fired at the end, a great number of pikes for wall fighting were got ready. Towers were raised, stage by stage, battlements and breastworks of wicker were attached to them. These are fixed wicker shields for the soldiers to hide behind after they've got a slingshot in or a lance thrown. Cicero himself, though he was at the moment in extremely bad health, did not even let himself rest at night, until at last he was compelled to spare himself by the protests of soldiers who crowded about him." End quote. So Cicero is under extreme pressure here, and the Nervii call out for a parley, and they make the same arguments that Ambiorix did. All of Gaul is risen up, the Germans are crossing the Rhine, etc., etc. They add that Sabinus and his legion are dead, and Ambiorix supplies them with the gory details. I think if you're making a movie, you're going to get Ambiorix to show Sabinus's head here. But, they say, our own feeling, I'm quoting here, however, towards Cicero in Rome is to refuse nothing except winter quartering, for we are unwilling that this practice should become established. So far as we are concerned, you have liberty to depart safe from your winter quarters, and to march off without fear in whatsoever direction you please." End quote. And Cicero here makes the right call. He's presented with really the same offer that Sabinus was. And Cicero says, "The Roman people do not negotiate with enemies under arms. If you want, lay down your arms, and I can send envoys to Caesar himself for you to make your case. I'm sure he'll look upon it with his usual sense of fairness." That took a bit of boldness, don't you think? Cicero is outnumbered 10-1. So for reasons you can imagine, the Nervii don't like his offer, and they start to build a 10-foot wall surrounding the entire fort. And you can judge how large a force of men they had by the fact that they build the entire thing, 15,000 feet in circumference, in only 3 hours, at least the foundation of it. And then they start building Roman-style movable sheds, the vineas, as Caesar calls them. And Caesar says that they're being instructed in this practice, building siege engines, etc., by the captives that they've taken. Uh-oh. So they're learning from the Romans how to storm a Roman fort. On the 7th day, there are heavy winds, and the Gauls shoot red-hot clay slingshot stones, and the thatched roofs of the huts in the camp catch fire. The Gauls see this, and they make a massive assault with ladders and ramparts and siege hooks. Quote, "But so great was the valor of the troops and such their presence of mind, that although they were everywhere scorched by the flame and harassed by the vast multitude of missiles, and understood that all their own baggage and all their possessions were ablaze, not only did no man leave the rampart to withdraw from the fight, but scarcely a man even looked behind him, and all that time fought with the greatest zeal and gallantry." End quote. And Caesar puts a nice concrete detail here. I really like this, to put you right there in the action. Quote, "When the flames had abated somewhat, in one place the Gauls moved a tower up to touch the rampart, whereupon the centurions of the 3rd cohort withdrew from their station and moved back all their men, and then began to invite the enemy by signs and shouts in case they should desire to come in. But not one of them dared advance. Then they were dislodged by volleys of stones from every side, and the tower was set on fire." End quote. So yes, come and take it, the Romans say. There's another great episode too. Have you ever seen the HBO Rome series? There are 2 major characters in it that represent everyday Romans, Pullo and Vorenus. And this chapter, this passage, is where the writers for that show got the idea for those characters. This is the real Pullo and Vorenus. Listen to this. Quote, "In that legion there were 2 most gallant centurions, now not far from the first class of their rank, Titus Pullo and Lucius Vorenus. They had continual quarrels together as to which one was to stand first, which is going to get promoted first, and every year they struggled in fierce rivalry for the chief posts. One of them, Pullo, when the fight was fiercest by the entrenchments, said, 'Why do you hesitate, Vorenus? Or what chance of proving your pluck do you wait for? This day shall decide our quarrels.' So saying, he stepped outside the entrenchments and dashed upon the section of the enemy which seemed to be in closest array. Nor did Vorenus keep within the rampart, but in fear of what all men would think, he followed hard. Then at short range Pullo sent his pike at the enemy, and pierced one man as he ran forward from the host. When the Gaul was struck senseless, the enemy sought to cover him with their shields, and discharged their spears in a volley at Pullo, giving him no chance of retirement. Pullo's shield was penetrated, and a dart was lodged in his belt. The accident threw his scabbard out of place and delayed his right hand as he tried to draw his sword, and while he was in difficulty, the enemy surrounded him. His rival, Vorenus, ran up to him and helped him in his distress. Upon him at once all the host turned and left Pullo, supposing him to be slain by the dart. Vorenus plied his sword at close quarters, and by slaying one man drove off the rest a little, and while he pressed on too eagerly, he fell down headlong into a dip in the ground. He was surrounded in his turn, but Pullo brought assistance, and both, unhurt, though they had slain several men, retired with the utmost glory within the entrenchments. In the eagerness of their rivalry, fortune so handled the two that for all their mutual hostility, the one helped and saved the other, and it was impossible to decide which should be considered the better man in valor." End quote. And I love that. Their rivalry is going to live to see another day. It never ends. All right, so the fighting gets more intense by the day. Cicero keeps sending out messengers, but they keep getting intercepted. Some of them are hauled in front of the Roman camp and tortured to death as the Romans look on from the ramparts. Finally, though, Cicero gets together with a Gallic friend of his, and together they persuade a brave Gallic slave with great rewards, and they hide a message in the shaft of his spear. And he sneaks out and he blends in with the natives, and he finally gets a message to Caesar, and that is how Caesar first learned of the extreme straits that Cicero was in. So now the scene switches to Caesar. And again, Caesar's not in Italy. He's camped at Samarobriva, which is modern Amiens. Judging by the map, he's at least 100 miles away. Then he pulls the message out of the spear at around 4 p.m., and by 9 a.m. the next day, he's on the move with one legion, and another legion under another commander joins him on the way, and they cover 20 miles on the first day. He tries to requisition more troops from Labienus, but Labienus says he thinks it's too risky to abandon his post, and Caesar respects his assessment, I think to his credit. And here's what he does next. Quote, "Although he was thereby disappointed in his expectation of obtaining 3 legions and reduced to 2, nonetheless he still regarded speed as the only means to the general safety, and proceeded by forced marches into the borders of the Nervii. There he learnt from prisoners what was taking place at Cicero's station, and how dangerous was his case. Then he persuaded one of the Gallic troopers, with great rewards, to deliver a letter to Cicero. The letter he sent, written in Greek, lest by intercepting it the enemy might get to know of our designs. The messenger was instructed, if he could not approach, to hurl a spear with the letter fastened to the thong inside the entrenchment of the camp. In the dispatch, Caesar wrote that he had started with the legions and would speedily be with him, and he exhorted Cicero to maintain his pristine virtue. Fearing danger, the Gaul ended up throwing the spear over the wall, as he had been instructed. By chance it stuck fast in the tower, and for 2 days it was not noticed by our troops. On the third day it was cited by a soldier, taken down and delivered to Cicero. He read it through and then recited it at a general assembly of the troops, bringing the greatest rejoicing to all. Soon the smoke of the fires was to be seen in the distance, and this banished all doubt about the arrival of the legions. Wow. Imagine being Cicero or one of his soldiers in that moment. So as soon as the Gauls realize what's going on, they abandon the siege of Cicero, and they send all 60,000 of their army to meet Caesar. And Cicero sneaks out another messenger to undertake the great personal risk of getting to Caesar, and he succeeds in informing him what's going on, which is important. And here's what Caesar does when he gets the message. Quote, "The dispatch was brought in about midnight. Caesar informed his troops thereof and aroused their spirits for battle. At dawn the next day he struck camp, and having advanced about 4 miles, he caught sight of the enemy's host across a valley and a stream. It was a very dangerous thing for so slender a force as he had to fight on unfavorable ground. Further, as he knew that Cicero was freed from blockade, he was without anxiety and thought he should abate his speed." So he knows he can take his time, thanks to Cicero's brave messenger. This is key. Caesar halted, therefore, and proceeded to entrench his camp in the most favorable position to be found. And his camp itself was already small, as he had scarcely 7,000 men, and none of these had heavy baggage. Nevertheless, Caesar compressed it further by narrowing the walkways as much as possible, deliberately aiming to provoke the greatest disdain from the enemy. End quote. So Caesar's already outnumbered here by more than 8-1, but his aim is to try to get the Gauls to underestimate him even more. So he starts, after this, sending his cavalry out to engage the enemy in little skirmishes. And so the following happens. Quote, "At the break of day, the enemy's horsemen came up to the camp and engaged our own cavalry. Caesar purposely ordered the cavalry to give way and to retire into camp. At the same time, he ordered the camp to be fortified with a higher rampart on all sides, the gates to be barricaded, and for the soldiers, in carrying out these measures, to run around in great confusion and display as much fear as possible." So the soldiers are running around panicking. He's also put up a facade of heavily barricading the gates. This is something that you do when you're desperate, because the gates are a natural weak point in a fortification. So he's put up this one layer of sod in front of the gates to make it look like he's kind of barricaded them in a panic. But as we'll see, that's a trick. And what do you know? It seems to work. The Gauls cross over the stream onto Caesar's side, and he's on an incline. It's very unfavorable territory for the Gauls, and they draw near in full array. Quote, "As our troops had been withdrawn even from the rampart, the Gauls approached nearer and discharged their missiles from all sides into the entrenchment. Next they sent heralds round about and ordered proclamation to be made that if anyone Gaul or Roman would go over to their side before the 3rd hour, he was at liberty to do so without danger. After that time there would be no chance." The words of confident men going on. "And indeed they held our troops in such contempt, thinking they could not break in by the gates, which had been barricaded for show with single rows of sods. Some of them set to work to tear down the rampart with their hands, others to fill in the trenches. Then Caesar caused a sally to be made from all the gates, and sending out the cavalry put the enemy speedily to flight, so overwhelmingly that not a man stood to fight. He slew a great number of them and stripped them all of their arms." End quote. So they bust out of the sod gate barrier there. It's just, a show. He chases them away, defeats them. With that, Caesar marches on the same day to Cicero's camp. And when he got there, quote, "he marveled at the towers erected, the shelters, the fortifications of the enemy, He assembled the legion for inspection and found that not even 1 in 10 of the soldiers were left unwounded. From all these evidences, he could judge with what danger and with what courage the operations had been carried out. He warmly praised Cicero, as he deserved, and the legion likewise. He addressed individually the centurions and tribunes whose valor, on the testimony of Cicero, he knew to have been exceptional. As touching the disaster of Sabinus and Cotta, he learned more particularly from the prisoners. The next day he held an assembly and set forth all that had occurred, cheering and encouraging the troops, and admonishing them to bear with greater equanimity the loss incurred through the fault and foolhardiness of a general, inasmuch as by the goodness of the immortal gods and by their own valor the misfortune had been made good, leaving to the enemy no lasting joy, to themselves no long-enduring grief. End quote. So in other words, we've been avenged by the gods. The gods have allowed us to get vengeance on our enemies. So that speech to the troops there, we imagine as a sort of first draft of the story that we got in the commentaries here. And I think one of the things that makes this whole arc especially effective is the way that Caesar tells these two stories in detail, Sabinus and then Cicero, in sequence, as a kind of comparison of two episodes so that we can learn from them. They're very similar circumstances with completely different outcomes because of the decisions of a single man in each case. In the first instance, Sabinus operating on uncertainty born of fear, and in the second, Quintus Cicero basing his decisions on the certainty and clarity that come from courage. Caesar decides, based on all the formidable Gallic uprisings that have occurred this year, that for the first time in the whole campaign, he's going to spend the entire winter at Gaul. It's just too volatile not to devote his full attention to Gaul. He can't return to northern Italy, to Cisalpine Gaul. And so he huddles in at Amiens, at Samaro Briva, and here's Caesar on the vibe in Gaul in the winter of 54 through 53. Meanwhile, quote, "When news was brought of Sabinus's great disaster, almost all the states of Gaul began to think of war, dispatching messengers and deputations in all directions to find out what the others purposed and where the war should start, and holding nightly councils in solitary places. And scarcely a moment the whole winter through passed without anxiety for Caesar, without the receipt of some message concerning the projected rising of the Gauls." End quote. Now, Caesar personally staying the winter in Gaul represents a serious escalation, and what we've seen in Book 5 so far is just a little foretaste of the huge storm that's finally going to break in Book 7 with the revolt of Vercingetorix, so stay tuned for that. Quote, "Indeed, the fact that they had found men to take the lead in an offensive war had so much weight among the natives and brought about such a universal change of feeling that, save the Aedui and the Remi, whom Caesar had always held in especial honor, the former for their old established and unbroken loyalty towards Rome, the good old Aedui, they would never revolt, right? The latter, the Remi, for their recent services in the Gallic War. Besides them, scarcely a single state was free from suspicion on our part." End quote. But Caesar comments here with that characteristic coolness and respect for his enemy in a rare first-person comment, quote, "And I am inclined to think that this is not so very remarkable, chiefly among several other reasons because this nation," the Gauls he means, "which had at one time surpassed all the others in military courage, was grievously indignant to have lost so much of that estimation as to submit to the sovereignty of the Roman people." He gets it. He'd probably revolt too if he were a Gaul. Now, Ambiorix, well, Caesar's going to spend another year hunting him down, more on him in the next episode. But before he closes the book, Caesar does share with us what happens to the resentful Gaul who started it all, old Indutio Maris of the Treachery that we met at the beginning of the episode. I'll let you go read Gallic War's Book 5 for the full treatment. It's interesting. But long story short, Indutio Maris attacks Titus Labienus, one of Caesar's finest legates, in his camp, and Labienus, with some smart generalship that would make Caesar proud, puts Indutio Maris to flight. Here's the final paragraph of the book. Quote, "Suddenly from two gates, Labienus launched forth all his cavalry." He's again gotten the enemy to treat the Roman fort with contempt. Continuing on, he specifically charged these cavalry that as soon as they had frightened the enemy and sent them flying, foreseeing exactly what would and did happen, they should all make for Indutio Maris alone, and no one was to wound a single other person until he saw the chieftains slain, as Labienus was absolutely determined to deny the man any opportunity to escape by taking advantage of the time they spent attacking the rest of the army. He offered great rewards to those who should kill him and sent up cohorts to support the horse. The astuteness of the plan was validated by fortune. In other words, they did flee, just like the Nervii and friends, when Caesar suddenly sallied out in his engagement in this book. And as all the force were making for one man, they caught Indutio Maris just in the ford of the river and slew him and brought his head back to the camp. During their return, the cavalry chased and killed all they could. On learning of this, all the forces of the Eburones and Nervii, which had assembled, departed. And thereafter, Caesar found Gaul somewhat more tranquil. End quote. So much for Indutio Maris and the attempted uprisings of the year 54. With that, Caesar ends Book 5 of On the Gallic Wars. If you enjoyed this and would like to get transcripts of these episodes with images and maps and other updates from the podcast, go subscribe for free to the Cost of Glory newsletter at costofglory.com. If you want to help us out in our mission to bring back classical greatness, do me a favor and leave us a good review, tell a friend, or perhaps more importantly, as you go about your day, act like Caesar's watching you. Because who knows? Maybe he is. Thanks for listening. Stay strong, stay ancient. This is Alex Petkus. Until next time.